Today we're diving headfirst into test-driven development, or TDD.
Ah, TDD.
Right. It's definitely one of those things in development that really sparks debate. You've got people who swear by it and others who are, let's say, less enthusiastic.
That's putting it mildly.
Yeah,
And the core idea, it seems simple, doesn't it? Just write your tests before you write the actual code.
exactly. Just flip the usual process. But doing that seems to touch on some really fundamental stuff about how we build software.
It really does. And that's where all these different, sometimes conflicting perspectives come from.
So our mission today, really, is to try and cut through some of that noise. We've looked at insights from, a bunch of developers with different backgrounds, different experiences,
Yeah, trying to get a feel for the arguments for TDD and the arguments against it.
and hopefully help you, our listener, understand the why behind these views without feeling like you're caught in some technical crossfire.
Right. We're looking at what people have actually seen work or not work, and maybe why, in different kinds of projects.
You are listening to Merge Conflicts Real Dev Talk, where passionate developers tackle code, culture, and everything in between.
Okay, so let's start with the why not. What are the main arguments against doing TDD? We saw one perspective that described it as feeling like a bureaucratic hurdle. What's behind that feeling?
Well, the core of it seems to be that it just feels unnatural, for a lot of engineers anyway. We tend to think about the solution first,
Yeah.
right? The feature.
You want to build the thing.
Exactly. And being forced to stop and write tests before you build can feel like it breaks that flow. It's counterintuitive for some. There was that great quote comparing it to asking a chef to rate the recipe before tasting the dish.
Okay, I remember that. It highlights that feeling of disconnect, doesn't it, between the creative part and the testing mandate.
Totally. Like you're getting bogged down in process instead of just, solving the problem directly.
And then there's this other worry
Yeah.
that TDD can actually lock in bad design. How would that work?
Okay, so imagine you have an idea for an API. You write your tests based on that initial idea.
Right.
But then as you actually start coding or thinking deeper, you realize, uh-oh, this API design isn't quite right.
Okay.
Now, you don't just have to refactor the code for the better design. You also have to go back and rewrite all those tests you wrote at the start.
So it feels like double the work.
Kind of, yeah. Like you wasted time testing something that was flawed from the get-go. The fear is investing effort in tests for something you end up throwing out or heavily changing.
That makes sense. Wasted effort.
Yeah.
And this perspective also brought up that, well, not every big successful tech company forces TDD on their teams.
Right. And the implication there is, well, if TDD was so critical, wouldn't everyone be doing it, especially the places known for top-tier engineering?
Good point. If it's not universal.
Then maybe it's not absolutely necessary in all cases. That's the argument. And this viewpoint also suggested some alternatives.
Like what? What do they suggest instead?
Things like prototype first, test later, or focusing testing efforts on the really high-impact stuff, like integration tests, end-to-end tests.
More big picture tests.
Yeah, and also just trusting your team more, perhaps, instead of relying on a strict process like TDD for everything. The overall sentiment was kind of like, TDD is a tool, a useful one maybe, but you use it when it fits. Don't treat it like a religion you have to follow blindly.
Okay, that's a pragmatic take. Use the right tool for the job. But all right, let's flip this. Why are so many developers really passionate about TDD? What are the big benefits they talk about?
Well, one of the biggest ones you hear is this idea of tests acting as clear contracts.
Contracts. How so?
Because you define the expected inputs and outputs first in your tests. Those tests basically become a living executable specification for how that piece of code is supposed to behave.
Okay, so it makes it really clear what something should do. Less ambiguity.
Exactly. It helps prevent misunderstanding, especially in a team, about how different parts are supposed to connect and interact. It's like a constantly verified blueprint.
I like that. A verified blueprint.
Yeah.
And what about safe refactoring? That sounds pretty important for keeping code healthy long term.
Oh, it's huge. When you have a good set of unit tests, those tests focusing on small, isolated bits of code, you have this amazing safety net.
Right.
If you need to change something later, maybe optimize it or add a feature, you run the tests. If anything breaks, you know immediately. You catch regressions instantly.
So you can change code with more confidence, less fear of breaking things silently.
Absolutely. Much less risky. It really encourages improving the code over time because it doesn't feel so dangerous.
Now, what about that startup situation? Someone building an MVP might say, look, TDD just slows us down too much right now. How do TDD fans respond to that?
Yeah, that comes up a lot. And they usually acknowledge, okay, the upfront time writing tests might feel slower initially.
Right, it feels like overhead.
But they argue that initial investment pays off big time down the road. You end up with code that's easier to maintain, more stable.
So less time fixing bugs later.
Exactly. While the MVP goal is speed now, TDD can actually save you a ton of time later by reducing bugs and making refactoring easier as the product grows. That can be a huge drag otherwise. We heard from one developer, like 20 years experience, who basically said TDD-aligned code bases were consistently easier to handle over the long haul.
That long-term view is pretty compelling. It's not just about today's bugs, it's building something sustainable.
Precisely. A lot of proponents see TDD as like a defensive practice. Writing the test first forces you to be really clear about what you're building, not more and not less, as one person put it.
So it clarifies the requirements for yourself.
Yeah. And the time spent on tests, they see it as a small investment for much better outcomes, better quality, less debugging. Some even said learning TDD was part of their shift from just being a developer to being a software engineer.
Wow, that's a strong statement. Fewer production bugs, better design.
That was the experience they shared, yeah.
Okay, but let's tackle a big criticism directly. The argument that the tests themselves can be wrong. What's the counter to that?
Well, the TDD folks often flip that chef analogy back.
Oh, yeah.
They say TDD isn't writing the recipe before tasting. It's deciding what taste you want first, that's the test, and then figuring out the recipe, the code, to achieve that taste.
Ah, okay. Define the goal first.
Right. And look, if your initial idea of the taste or the requirement is wrong, that's a risk whether you write tests first or just start coding a prototype. The potential flaw isn't unique to TDD.
So being wrong about the goal can happen either way.
Pretty much. And about that API design is wrong issue, TDD fans point out, first, you can discover that with a prototype too, but also TDD encourages really small, iterative steps. Red-green refactor.
Right, the cycle.
So you're constantly refining the tests in the code as you learn. It's not about locking things in stone from minute one. The tests evolve with the design. And remember, good TDD isn't just unit tests. It includes integration and E2E tests too.
Okay, that makes sense. It's more fluid than maybe it sounds. We also heard TDD is seen as crucial for team collaboration. How does it help teams work together better?
The idea is that those tests, those contracts, become a shared language. Unambiguous.
Ah, everyone's on the same page about how X is supposed to work.
Exactly. When you have multiple people touching the code, the tests are clear documentation. It reduces confusion, reduces the need for endless meetings just to figure out how things are meant to fit together.
Less meeting time, more coding time.
That was a claim. One source said it's key if you don't want to spend half your day clarifying things.
Makes sense. Now, another thing that keeps coming up is that TDD is just, well, hard. Hard to master. It feels slow at first.
Yeah, and that's totally valid. It is a hurdle, that feeling of being slowed down, especially when you think you know exactly how to write the code. It can be really frustrating initially.
So why push through that friction?
Well, the argument is that feeling often means you haven't quite integrated testing into how you think about the problem yet. It still feels like a separate chore, not part of the design process itself.
So the goal is to make writing the test part of figuring out the solution.
Exactly. The act of writing the test forces you to think deeply about the requirements, the edge cases, the interface. It becomes a design tool.
Okay. And what about the fact that it's not universally adopted? Does that mean anything?
Some argue that, well, maybe true masterful programming, the kind that just inherently produces robust, testable code, is actually quite rare, above the average standard.
Interesting thought.
So while many teams deliver software, maybe those without strong testing disciplines like TDD are just building up more legacy problems, more maintenance headaches for the future. Problems that TDD helps you avoid proactively.
So it takes practice to get there.
Definitely. It's described as a discovery tool, helps break down complexity, but yeah, it takes dedicated learning. Months, maybe, to really get it.
We also heard a simpler take. With tests, more is better than less whether you write them before, during, or after coding. Just have tests.
Yeah, that's a pragmatic view, isn't it? It just acknowledges tests are good things to have, period.
Right.
And in a team, even if tests were written later, they still help everyone understand how things are supposed to work, even if you didn't write that specific part. Shared understanding.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, there was an interesting, maybe slightly chilling real-world example mentioned, the VW emissions scandal. How did that relate to testing?
Yeah, that was less about TDD specifically and more about the fundamental importance of, well, honest and rigorous testing.
Okay.
The suggestion was that people inside VW must have known about the cheat device because of testing. It highlights this ethical side. Testers and developers have a responsibility to make sure tests reflect reality and that problems found are actually addressed, not, covered up.
So, beyond just code quality, there's an ethical weight to doing testing properly.
Absolutely. And bringing it back to TDD, the general vibe from proponents is embrace it. It's valuable, it's adaptable, it pays off long term.
Though maybe applied strategically. We heard about using it for pure functions.
Right, functions where you have really clear inputs and expected outputs. TDD works exceptionally well there. It's a place where you can get immediate, tangible value.
That makes sense. Focus the effort. What about those so-called elite teams? How do they apparently approach testing?
The perspective shared there was interesting. It was something like, elite teams only write as many tests as needed to stop themselves breaking production 2 years later when they've forgotten the details.
Huh. Okay, so it's very forward-looking and pragmatic.
Yeah, strategic, experience-driven, not necessarily writing tests for everything, but creating that essential safety net for the future, focusing on preventing real-world problems.
Now, we also heard the opposite concern again, that TDD feels too rigid when you're still figuring out the what and why of a feature. Back to that locking in bad design fear.
It is related, yeah. If the requirements are still fuzzy or changing fast, writing very specific tests up front can feel like premature optimization.
Yeah.
You might write tests for behavior that gets thrown out.
Wasted effort again.
Right. And that's where alternatives like BDD, behavior-driven development, often get mentioned.
BDD, how's that different?
BDD focuses more on describing the behavior from a user's point of view, often in plain language. It can be a bit more flexible when the exact implementation details aren't settled yet. TDD is generally more code-focused, BDD more behavior-focused.
Okay. But the diehard TDD fans, they really push back on that chef analogy, don't they?
Oh, strongly. The counter is basically, good chefs do know what taste they're aiming for before they start throwing ingredients together. And engineers should think about how the code needs to work before they just start typing.
So, upfront thinking is always needed.
That's the point. And they'd argue TDD is a great way to structure that thinking. Plus, they say you can prototype with TDD. They aren't mutually exclusive.
And the benefits seem to really scale up with bigger, more complex systems.
Definitely. In large systems with lots of developers, that clarity from tests, the documentation aspect, the refactoring safety net, it all becomes way more critical. It helps manage the complexity.
We also heard a really personal take on why someone likes TDD.
Yeah, that was insightful. They said, writing a test is how I think about the problem so I can solve it better.
So the test writing is the problem-solving process for them.
Pretty much. Not just checking afterwards, but actually designing through the test. They even mentioned changing tests before changing an API, really emphasizing that interface stability.
Which ties back to how disruptive API changes can be, especially once code is out there.
Exactly. If your tests are the first users of your API, they act as an early check on its design and usability. TDD encourages getting that API right, or at least better, earlier.
Right.
And it's key to remember, as one source said, the goal of TDD is code, not tests. The tests are the way you get to good working code. They're a valuable byproduct.
And within the testing world, unit tests have a specific job.
They do. If you know your individual units, your small pieces, work correctly in isolation, that's what unit tests verify, then when you do bigger integration tests, you've already ruled out a lot of potential problems.
Narrows down where bugs might be.
Exactly. You build confidence from the ground up. Known good components make debugging the whole system much easier.
So, the advice seems to land on use TDD strategically, when it makes sense.
That feels like a good summary. It's great for defining clear units, managing dependencies, especially in complex architectures. Just trying to write a unit test often forces you to design better. Think about what needs isolating or mocking.
But don't force it if it's genuinely blocking you.
Right. There's a caution against being too rigid if it's really hindering progress or just doesn't fit the specific task well.
And even in early stages, like proof of concepts.
The idea was that aiming for components that do one thing well, single responsibility principle, and have clear inputs-outputs, even in a POC, makes them inherently more testable later. TDD encourages those good design habits early, though maybe not for everything like complex graphical stuff.
So ultimately, the best testing approach really depends on, well, everything.
Pretty much. The project stage, is it brand new or mature? How critical is it? Are features stable or changing daily? Team size, team skills, how clear the tasks are? It all matters.
Which makes those top-down, one-size-fits-all testing rules in big companies seem maybe less than ideal.
Yeah, they can be problematic. Compared to, say, a small, skilled team that can just agree on what makes sense for them right now, context is key.
And the cost of not having good tests, which TDD helps with, can be really high later.
That was a stark warning. Ignoring testing leads to scrambling to fix hidden bugs later, wasting by 8 hours multiple developers' time. TDD helps build that solid 0-0 trust foundation.
Okay, so for a listener who feels like TDD is that round peg in a square hole for their situation, what's a practical way forward?
That hybrid approach sounded quite sensible. Maybe start with quick prototypes for validation, get the API or UX roughed out.
Okay.
Then once things stabilize a bit, bring in targeted unit tests for the core logic and definitely robust end-to-end tests to cover the main user flows.
So flexibility early, robustness later.
Kind of, yeah. Balancing exploration with building a safety net as things solidify.
That seems like a good way to bridge the gap. And TDD has these other benefits too, right? Beyond just finding bugs.
Totally. The active writing tests first naturally pushes you towards cleaner interfaces. It almost forces you to think about solid principles because you need that separation of concerns to make things testable.
So it improves the design, almost as a side effect.
Yes. Even if you theoretically threw the tests away later, which you probably wouldn't, the design process itself benefited. And that complaint about refactoring tests all the time. Often that means you're writing too many tiny, brittle tests. Maybe fewer higher-level feature tests would be more resilient.
It really does sound like maybe some criticisms miss the main point of TDD.
It feels that way sometimes. It's not just about having tests, it's a whole discipline, as someone called it, that shapes how you write code more decoupled, more modular, easier to test.
And maybe more fun. Someone mentioned that.
Yeah, the idea that writing a test that fails, then making it pass, red-green, is more engaging than writing tests after the fact when the code already works. It feels more like building.
And it makes untestable code harder to write in the first place.
Almost impossible, one person claimed. If you write the test first, you have to make the code testable to make the test pass.
And those tests become documentation.
Right. Built-in, formal, unambiguous docs that are always in sync with the code because they have to run.
So wrapping this up, it seems like despite the criticisms, the strong message from many sources is that TDD actually ensures good design.
That's a powerful argument. It's testing the design, the contract, not just the specific lines of code implementing it. So you can change the implementation details, refactor freely, and as long as the design holds, the tests still pass.
Okay, so as we finish this deep dive on TDD, we've definitely seen this core tension. On one hand, the perceived overhead, the potential rigidity.
And on the other, these really significant claimed benefits for quality, for maintainability, for how teams work together.
And these aren't just abstract ideas we heard from developers sharing real experiences, different contexts leading to different conclusions. There probably isn't one single right way to do this.
No, almost certainly not. It really depends.
So for you listening, the key takeaway is probably to think hard about your own situation, your project's needs, your team's dynamics. Where does TDD or parts of it fit in or not fit in?
Right. Be thoughtful about applying it.
And maybe a final thought, could the fact that TDD sparks such intense debate actually be a sign of how important the underlying ideas, testing, design, thinking ahead really are in software development?
That's an interesting point. Even if people disagree fiercely on the how, maybe the intensity points to the importance of building reliable, maintainable software. Something to consider as you think about how your own approach lines up with all this.